we will now be moving on to a very exciting new panel titled Maximizing Power, Cost-Effective Solutions for Existing Buildings. So for this panel, we will include our friends, Naveed, Sherry, and Daniel. So Naveed, you've got the screen. Please unmute yourself, show us your video, and take it away.
First, want to thank Sven, Actera, Alfred. Thank you for having me on behalf of SCE. Excited to be here and kind of talk about this. So let me just jump right into it because I think I've got about 10 minutes. So I know we're kind of talking about getting into the weeds a little bit on how to install multifamily or install EV charging on a multifamily property. A little background about myself. I'm a senior advisor for our eMobility team, specifically business development and partnership. So very simply, my goal is to get our customers in our 50,000 square mile territory, answer their questions, make them feel comfortable, and ultimately have them apply for our Charge Ready program if they choose to install EV charging. And we're particularly focused on multifamily properties right now. So I'm going to be quick on this part. Just for context, if anyone is not familiar, what is Southern California Edison? So we're a 135-year-old investor-owned utility company, electric only. So we are a private company owned by shareholders and investors, but as all utilities, right, in California, regulated by the CPUC and then FERC at a federal level. So there are 5 million customer accounts at SCE, government, multifamily, commercial, across 50,000 square miles. That comprises 185 cities, 15 counties, 13 Native American tribal nations. I like to include this. Our profits are not tied to the amount of electricity we deliver, and more than 80% of the electricity that's delivered to our 5 million customer accounts is generated by independent power producers. So we're talking about EV charging today. We often refer to it as transportation electrification. So very simply, just since 2014, you can see the wide range of incentives that we have for our customer base. We're going to zero in on what I've got circled or dotted here, our Charge Ready 2 program, which launched last summer. But I like to share this to kind of show the broad range of ways we're trying to promote transportation electrification across our territory. So what is Charge Ready? Customers will often ask me, do you guys sell EV charging stations? Like, how does it work? And I try to boil it down simply as this. Over the last 6 years, we've installed 2,500 charging ports across 140 plus different sites. So very simply, if you decide to install EV charging with SCE, you're going to get experienced insight, the technical planning, the technical execution, and then what most people sort of identify with is the funding, right? So our job is to install the infrastructure, maintain it, and cover the costs. We are very invested in our customers owning and operating those owning and operating those EV charging stations. There is a small number that we own and operate on behalf of the customers, but that's only for multifamily customers in disadvantaged communities as defined by Cal EnviroScreen, who choose to have us support them in that manner. So I often will tell people I'm a non-technical person, but part of why I have to understand enough details to be dangerous is so I can answer customers' questions. So very simply, we offer a lot of flexible options to our multifamily customers to get EV charging installed, right? So I kind of think of it as front of the panel, behind the panel. And I'll kind of start at the top and work my way down. So option one, which you see, which is SCE built, that's kind of, I think, what a lot of folks identify with, where SCE is covering the most amount of sort of the value chain. So in that situation, we're having to come in, do retrofitting and constructing. We'll examine the transformer to make sure it can handle the capacity. We're going to install a separate meter and then do the panel to the front as well, up until the stub outs for the charging station. So in that example, SE is covering everything up until the stub outs. And as I said before, the customer in the vast majority of options is owning and operating the charging station. If we go down to option number 2, I kind of like to say, compared to option 1, this is where the customer has more flexibility where to put their charging stations, but they're getting less money from SCE, right? So you're sacrificing in option 1, right? Because we're required by the CPUC to kind of have a reasonable cost estimate in order to install these charging stations. Option 2, right? In option 1, we're going to be very sort of, we're going to provide a strong recommendation on where the charging stations can go. The sweet spot is kind of 100 feet from the supporting transformer. Option 2, the customer may say, hey, I don't want the stations there, want to put them on this side of the property. In that option, right, the customer is responsible, including getting the permitting and everything from the panel all the way out to the stub outs and the stations, right? So they're getting more flexibility. And then what SCE will do will cover 80% of what their estimated costs will be, right? So let's say in that example, the customer pays $200,000 to a contractor to get everything installed. SCE estimated the cost at $100,000. They would get $80,000 tacked on to their rebate amount, after the stations are installed and energized. So I can go into a lot of nuance about each of these options, but I think options 1 and 2 kind of give you a good high level overview, and happy to answer questions as we progress along. So I wanted to share just one case study. So this is Surfside 1 condominiums in Port Waname. I don't know if I pronounced that right, but if I didn't, I apologize. So this condo complex was built in the 1970s, and the stations were installed in 2019 through our pilot program. So prior to the stations getting installed, there were 2 EVs at the complex. After installation, as of February of this year, the number has jumped up to 18. So they've been very happy with the outcome. This is a quote from the current HOA vice president. Charge Ready was key to making it possible to install the chargers. Without the program, the HOA wouldn't have been able to justify the expenditure. So wanted to share one tangible example where we installed 10 EV charging stations and the customer's been very happy post-installation. I'm going to go ahead and drop something in here. I know we're going to be chatting and going across a whole range of things, but wanted to invite everyone. We're having a June 2nd event. All multifamily business professionals are invited. So I will drop this in here. 2 links. The first link is if you're interested in maybe working with us for your multifamily property, fill out our interest form. It'll take 5-6 minutes and we'll get in touch with you. The second link, right, is going to allow you to register for this event. So same thing, we'll kind of get into a little bit more details and we'll kind of go from there. So with that, I know we're seeing some questions in the chat, but I want to be respectful of my time. So I'm gonna, I think, hand it off to my colleague on the panel.
That's correct. We will be doing questions from the chat at the very end. Thank you so much, Naveed, for sharing your thoughts. And we will now move on to Sherry from Ecology Action. Sherry, welcome to the screen.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so pleased to be invited to speak on this panel today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Blow it up here. So I am Sherry Lee Bryan. I work at Ecology Action. We're a 501c3 nonprofit and a general contractor based out of Santa Cruz, California. And I'm the EV program manager at our organization. And I've been asked to speak to the group today about some case studies from actual, installations at affordable housing properties in Silicon Valley Clean Energy Service Territory in the South San Francisco Bay Area. So just a little bit about our organization. Ecology Action has been around for 50 years. We were formed in 1970. We specialize in energy efficiency projects for hard to reach commercial customers. And we also do a lot of community work, community program work in active transportation, bike safety, electric bike programs, rebate programs, and of course, electric vehicle demand generation, right? So we not only want to install charging stations, we also want to encourage lower income and moderate income folks to get into electric vehicles. So we run a purchase guidance program that helps people walk through the crazy complicated mess of all the rebates and incentives they're eligible for. So we have deep experience in multifamily, helped 695 properties get energy efficiency and EV charging installed. So this pilot that I'm going to talk about today was funded by Silicon Valley Clean Energy Innovation On-Ramp Grant. And we were trying to test a direct installation idea that we have successfully implemented in thousands of commercial facilities for energy efficiency, which is to make the whole experience really hassle-free for the property manager to install electric vehicle charging. And basically, we installed 3 sites in this pilot, and 478 rental units were served. And we did a lot of low power, because our idea is to use our existing power on the electrical infrastructure on the property, rather than spend a lot of money bringing extra energy in from the utility. So how do we use existing power to get these projects done? So direct installation is just a fancy word for folks who are not familiar with just providing turnkey services, so design, permitting, and installation support with one signature. So there's no bidding. Basically, there's a project manager, and things are just sort of flow smoothly for the property operator. Electric vehicle charging doesn't make any return on investment for a multifamily property operator. It's just an extra amenity to attract a tenant. And so that's pretty important to make it hassle-free. And we wanted to prioritize assigned parking spaces from the tenant's point of view. Folks want reliable access to charging, just like if they were to live in a single-family home. So just to kind of start out getting the community invested in charging, we felt that it was important to work on having dedicated assigned charging, and that works really well with level 1, as you've heard from other presenters. Another important part of the pilot is that we're really doing a lot of on-site education for the residents to engage them in how to use the chargers, and that they're for them, and also for the management, the facility staff, they need a lot of support understanding how to sign up their residents for the charging, and how to create the billing system to charge the residents for power. So the first site that we really loved was owned by Bridge Housing. This is a site in Milpitas, California, 306 units. And each of these little clusters that you can see are served by one electrical panel for the common areas. So site lighting and garages. Resident garages are all on the common area meter. So there's really no opportunity to, install EV charging dedicated to a particular person's meter. The meters are very far away from where folks' garages are. Very cost prohibitive to do that. So when we came on the scene, we found that the apartment management was actually walling off the outlets in people's garages, folks that owned electric vehicles, because they were really worried that their energy bills were going to increase from the residents charging and not being able to recoup the money for electricity. So we're trying to find a solution here, utilizing the main panel, the common area panel, to provide enough charging for folks in these various residential units throughout the property. So we put a power meter on a representative panel, and we found really quickly that the actual amount of power available was not enough to power even a level 1 20 amp circuit. Like we couldn't justify based on the current loads on the house panels that there was any power available. But we saw this pattern in the power study, and the pattern was site lights were gobbling up most of the peak demand. So luckily the property owner had planned for an energy efficiency retrofit, a site lighting upgrade to LED. And so we came in after that retrofit happened, and we observed a 69% reduction in energy demand, freeing up power for us to install charging. So like key takeaway here is, coupling charging after an energy efficiency upgrade is a great way to make sure that when you go in there, there will be existing power available to set up electric vehicle charging. So incredible energy reduction. Kudos to the folks at Bright Power and folks who worked on this particular retrofit. So here was the solution. Here's all these different unit complexes, and there's basically an electrical meter, a sub-meter in each of these locations. So rather than find a centralized location where we can just install a bunch of chargers, the idea from the management was that they thought their tenants wanted convenient access where they live. They didn't want to have their tenants walk, across a 40-acre property to get their groceries back home after charging. So what we did is we basically went for the lowest cost solution, which was to install a Plugzio outlet for an assigned charging right here on the building. So what that looks like is basically installing a 20 amp circuit, running the conduit out of the wall, and then here it is, right adjacent to an assigned parking space. So these residents can come, first serve, and sign up for that space. And it's also, we designed the system so that back here, you can see on this map, we're always concerned about like, okay, when is the capacity of the system going to be exceeded, right? Like we installed 8 chargers here, they're assigned at first, but what happens when the volume of EV owners exceed the amount of chargers available for assignment? So we always look for a place on the property where we can easily convert a assigned charging space to a shared space when that is occurring. So these spaces over here in Garage D, they are strategically positioned so that you can convert one parking space adjacent to the charging space to an ADA accessible space, which is required when you convert to a shared charging situation. So we kind of future-proof it for that eventual reality that we know is coming. So the cost of electricity here for the residents was super cheap because it's all based on what the property owner is paying the utility for the rate schedule. So in this case, the rate schedule was a schedule that was one of the cheaper ones for commercial. So the cost for charging is 12 cents a kilowatt hour. Plugzio does allow for tiered rates. So the property owner can make sure to set charging during higher during the cost during peak demand times. So the one thing about using Plugzio is that the property owner can't really avoid cellular fees while the chargers aren't being used. And so one of the things we try to do is prepay those fees so that the property owner doesn't have to have that burden while they're waiting for their residents to purchase EVs and get assigned to a spot. So again, there's no ROI on this, so property owners are pretty reluctant to pay fees for an amenity that's not being used. So second site that I want to present is the site we did in Morgan Hill. This was actually a load managed L2 solution. Came on the site. This is newer construction, plenty of power at the panel. We've got the limiting factor here is the 100 amp main breaker supplying this 250 amp panel. But because the site was already constructed to code, to energy efficiency codes, we were able to get a couple L2s on here, and we used EverCharge, which you'll see in a minute. So just like the previous speaker, Naveed was saying, there's that sweet spot, 100 feet from your electrical panel, and he was saying the transformer, but when you're using existing power on site, you're looking at like, what is the cheapest, path to the parking space, right? So that you're not cutting through concrete, that increases the cost. But this is a typical situation where you do have to cut through a sidewalk to install the chargers. And here's what they look like. We used EverCharge here because in this affordable housing property, they again did not want to have any costs. Like they couldn't afford any ongoing costs for cellular and networking fees. And so EverCharge is a model that passes that cost on to the resident. So residents are assigned to these spots. They are given a card, an access card to unlock charging that's unique to them. And then they are charged $15 a month for access to that particular charger. And then at any point when the amount of EV drivers exceeds the amount of EV chargers, EverCharge can transition to a shared EV charging payment system. So the chargers can become shared. And we future-proof that by basically, again, making sure that these spots have an adjacent ADA compliant spot. So from the map over here, you can see here's one pedestal, here's another pedestal, and the number 3, charger number 3, this is already striped. And so the parking spot adjacent to number 3 can be striped when we're ready for the properties ready to make that investment to go through shared charging. So let's see here. Yeah, this is a great site. A resident saw the chargers and bought an EV like the next week. So we love it when that happens. So the cost breakdown for the 3 pilot sites, you can see here using our existing power. Average cost between the 3 was $3,411 per port. The lowest was over at Monte Vista, that first case study I showed you, less than $1,400 per port. So that's just because we had installed a port right on the adjacent of a building, no trenching required, kept the installation costs very low. So again, you know, resident outreach super critical in this whole endeavor. We did, it was during COVID, so outreach was quite challenging, but we ended up making sure that we could do online workshops with residents, and that was pretty successful. So we did lots of door-to-door canvassing, you know, just leaving flyers for residents so that they understood what was going on and the changes to come. And I know I don't have a lot of time, so tried to rush through pretty quickly. Thanks again. Here's my contact information if you have any questions and you want access to the full results of that pilot.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing that information with us. Now we'll move on to Daniel. Daniel, please take it away. You've got the screen.
Well, great. Thanks so much for having me. Sven, Alfred, thank you so much for putting this all together. So my name is Daniel Grossbach. I'm the head of sales over at Coil. We are headquartered up in San Francisco, but have offices all throughout the West Coast. We were founded in 2019. And what we were trying to do is really take an industry that had processes that were somewhat archaic and really create a standardization for it. And with so many new products in the renewables industry coming up, specifically EV charging, we wanted to create seamless processes and a solution that would work for multiple verticals as well as many different channel partners and programs. Here are some of our partners. We could really get into the weeds in terms of EV charging and all the different use cases that we've seen across the board. But we really wanted to tailor this short presentation to multi-unit housing, specifically HOAs that we've worked with. So we partner with automotive OEMs, fleet and transportation companies, property management or asset owners, as well as the EV charging manufacturers themselves. So the focus of today's presentation is really around our HOA solution at Coil. And this is tied specifically to plenty of HOAs we've worked with and provide the solution for. But in this case study, this is 320 Alabama, which is an HOA building in San Francisco. And some of the issues that we that we see early on in the sales process are, of course, just getting approval. The votes go back and forth on the board. We need, really very much a majority or a complete buy-in if we're going to provide this as an amenity, especially, if this is coming out of reserves or being paid for by all the residents. And the major pain points are eliminating the big monthly recurring fees, very expensive installation fees that might be shared amongst people that don't even have an EV. And then, obviously an easy to understand, seamless process for people to follow, where there's not a lot of, apps or analytics involved that can, confuse people throughout this process. So in terms of this case study for 320 Alabama, what we were tasked with was taking, 12 EV owners that all wanted to have access to charging in the building. And the first way this starts is kind of, getting that vote together, seeing if this is a majority vote. Of course, when you have 12 EV owners and maybe a few others that don't have an EV yet, but would expect to, you don't have a complete buy-in. So this started off really just being a way to see, is there a way to figure out a solution where we can offer charging as an amenity and not be seen as like a nuisance to the rest of the residents? So the big thing was, how can we direct billing, specific to that unit, right to the end customer or the resident? How could we figure out a way to present this to the HOA where they wouldn't be responsible for the installation costs? In a lot of cases, while the HOA will kind of be that B2B customer, they are collecting money from the residents in advance. And then, how can we, do load management effectively here and plan for the future? So what we figured out at Coil was, going direct to the individual meters, and we call this a meter tap. And so the solution in this case is, we're just finding, the residents that would be interested in a meter tap installation. We put together tiered pricing based on the distance. So there might be, tiers 1 through 4 based on a general approximate distance from the meters. And at first you're going to get a little bit of pushback with, well, I'm 5 feet away from my meter, and some people are 100 feet away. Well, the whole purpose of this is the more people that you have buying into this whole installation, you really get a better average when you put it all together, and it really makes it reasonable for everyone. So in this case, we determined, again, Coil's brand agnostic. So, we're not repping a specific brand or solution out there in the market, but what we saw in this case was, alongside getting approvals from the residents and implementing a meter tap, we also found that the Wallbox Pulsar Plus was a really great solution, not just through power sharing, but through very easy configuration and no long-term contracts or recurring fees. So in terms of installation costs, as I mentioned, these are split up into tiers and then averaged out. So we do a set number per unit, and that's going to be billed the same to each resident, or in some cases billed as a sum to the HOA, and they've already billed the residents in advance. And so this is really great because, in terms of the project management side of this whole process in general, is, we reduce those labor costs from, several returned visits, individual appointments for, scheduling EV charger installations. And also we can reduce the total permit fees and project management costs that would otherwise be, lumped into a commercial proposal. And then the great thing from the load management side is, there's a great distribution of power in terms of the building's actual capacity, and also with each resident's meter. And so this includes benefits, with, implementing this type of amenity to specific residents that want this type of a service in the building. The EV chargers can all communicate with each other when they are configured to Wi-Fi. And of course, there's no need for the HOA to go out of pocket for the expense. And then, maybe there's a way for me to circulate this later, but just as a general overview of what's being discussed, this just illustrates, what that looks like from the, existing electrical infrastructure within the building, and that meter tap to each unit's meter, and then connectivity and load management across the board for all the residents that buy into an HOA installation. So thank you again for your time, and really appreciate the amount of people involved in trying to create efficiency and a solution within the industry.
Looks like we momentarily lost Alfred. I have a quick question for you all. Sherry, what happens if 30% of the people at the first case study get EVs over time? Is there how would you squeeze out more power? And again, I want to compliment you on doing the load study at the beginning and identifying the non-LED lighting. I'm back to Alfred.
Well, hello. Sorry about that minor interruption. So folks, yes, if you wouldn't mind answering that question.
Yeah, great question. So I pointed out toward the end an area in the complex where we could easily convert to a one shared charging spot, and there would need to be some kind of reservation system, that Plugzale currently is developing an L2 solution. So charging would be faster, but you wouldn't necessarily assign that spot. You would need to have some kind of way to hassle-free way the property manager isn't going to have to deal with people overstaying in that particular area. So to be determined. The nice thing about the site LED change out was that we actually freed up enough power for having enough L2 charging solution, but it was already designed at the time and we didn't have enough money for it in the grant budget. So we actually could have installed L2 at each location or 2 L1s. We could have doubled them up, but it was just a function of the budget that we had from the grant. And of course, the property owner had no funds to contribute because it was, an affordable housing property. So yeah, so the idea is to make one or more shared charging stations as a part of the mix in a future reality where there's 30% of those property owners or property renters own EVs.
Fantastic. And now, Naveed, have we already asked you about the 18 chargers question?
I don't think so. I don't think I've gotten a question yet. I answered a few in the chat, so.
Oh, perfect. Well, I think that there are some other questions in the chat that we would love to entertain. For instance, what options are available to combine EV with solar installations? And are there any cost-effective options?
So I'll answer that from SCE. We do accommodate folks who want to either install or currently have solar on their roof. The exact process is outside of my scope, but there's an interconnection team that can accommodate both. And we do have customers who want to install EV charging and solar at the same time, and we accommodate both. So that's as far as I know from my perspective, but if you have any additional questions, feel free to reach out to me and I can dig up the answer for you.
Well, that's very interesting. Thank you. Daniel, what is the general nature of Coil's collaboration with automakers?
Yeah, so our current collaboration right now is both on we handle, our foot in the door with a lot of the automotive OEMs is for residential home installation. Many of these are single family homes or individual condos that turn into this HOA meter tap situation that I presented. But so we handle a lot of residential home installations, but we're also handling a lot of the OEM requirements to the dealerships. So generally right now that includes one level 3 charger and then one level 2 charger in service and one as well in sales.
Gotcha. And Daniel, can you access both common power and individual unit power?
Yes, absolutely.
Fantastic. Naveed, at the Surfside complex, if there are 18 EV drivers and only 10 chargers, how do they share the chargers?
Yeah, that's a fair question. So one, I think, let me back up and say that, our job and how we see it is to make sure the infrastructure gets installed efficiently and it is in good working order. The stations themselves, that's owned and operated by the customer, and we don't get involved in the price that they want to set or any sort of, scheduling that they do. So I don't know the answer for that particular property, but here's some things to consider. One, if you're in a condo complex and you have deeded parking, right? That's an example where you have deeded parking, and maybe those are the parking spaces that are most cost effective and closest to the transformer. But if it's deeded and the customer and the folks who have those spots either don't have an EV, or even if they do, they may sort of balk at the thought of construction to get them installed, right? So I think one consideration would be, okay, do you have deeded spots or not? I think in this example with Surfside, they had outdoor parking. I don't know for sure, but when there's outdoor parking and residents can park anywhere they see fit, that just opens up more options, right? So as far as like how many cars you can charge, right? So DC fast charging is not an option through Charge Ready, and these were at level 2. You kind of got to think about it of like, okay, if somebody's getting a full charge, maybe they only want to do it for an hour or two. But if they're looking for a full charge, you're probably looking at anywhere from 3 to 6 hours, right? Depending on the vehicle. So also, right, we always want, because when you go through Charge Ready, you're going to be put on a TOU rate, right? So that 4 to 9 p.m. or that 5 to 8 p.m., right, is going to be the highest cost. So another thing to sort of consider is, do you really want customers to be charging during that window? And some of the ways that a customer can discourage somebody from charging during that window is they can raise the price, right, depending on their level 2 charger, and kind of, people sort of respond and they'll realize, okay, I need to go and plug my car in before I go to bed, or plug it in the morning if I'm working from home. So I didn't really answer your question, but the point is that it's really on the HOA and the business professionals for that condo and apartment to figure out how they want to sort of manage it, right? We can give examples and give recommendations, but they're the owners and operators.
Something to add real quick, if that's okay. Just
Go
there's
for it.
many EVSPs like EV Match, Heather's here on the call, Amp Up, and other open source software types of platforms that can help property managers do reservation-based systems and set pricing to avoid peak hours. So lots of options out there. Those are just a couple, and great solutions too. That is a huge factor of resistance, with property managers wanting to embark on this new type of thing. But renters are used to using amenity reservation systems, right? When you live in a shared community environment, not every resource is available at any given time. So residents are used to reserving the gym or reserving the pool or, whatever. So it's not uncommon for that to happen in a multifamily environment.
Well, Sherry, that brings me to my next question. Given a budget of $2,000 per level 1, how many could you have installed and how many units are there at the first case study?
Okay, there are 306 units, and how many we could have installed is a function of the amount of power available and if we were able to get it through permitting, because you can't exceed 125% of the existing demand plus the new demand, right, according to electrical code. So the answer to the question is, with the LED site light upgrade, we could have installed a total of 16 L1s at the site.
Well, that's fascinating. Do you think sharing parking spaces works over sharing power?
I'm going to try to take a stab at that question. I don't think it's an either or. Most times you don't have a choice but to share the power. And it's just a management question, whether or not the management prefers an assigned parking versus a shared parking strategy.
Gotcha. Well, Daniel, have you ever had to say no to installing chargers? As in, was there ever not enough power or cost?
Yeah, I think that we've seen in terms of a lot of the multi-unit dwellings that we've seen in the past or current right now, a lot of buildings that are tend to be older, don't have the available capacity for charging. And sometimes that's not specific to say other areas where charging could be allowed or accessible, but could be as simple as, if they want to not have to go back to the utility, we'd be looking at charging near, say, like the common space pool area, versus in a covered garage. So those are some things that I think are misunderstood early in the sales process and not taken into consideration. Other areas are, where we know that there's a certain budget approved, but we are seeing, say, a garden style complex, which requires a lot of trenching and a lot of concrete work. And, that definitely is far outside a smaller budget.
I see. Well, that's very, very interesting. So, Naveed, given the high cost of retrofitting, is SCE doing anything to incentivize installations at the time of new construction?
Yes. Wow. I didn't even pay you to ask that question. I didn't really get into the detail, but we are highly, highly interested in capturing folks as they're in the development process. So we have an option called the new construction rebate. And the interesting thing about this, we really try to capture people. If you're developing our property in our territory, and let's say you just got approval from city council, we want you to engage us then, right? So obviously, I think earlier in the conference, folks were talking about Cal Green Code. I know it's going to adjust effective 2023. Let's talk about it, what it is today. So effective today, right, whether anywhere in California, commercial, multifamily, government, 10% of your parking needs to be EV capable, right? So what that means is that you basically have all the, I like to call it piping, everything up until the stub out on 10% of your spaces. So if you're a multifamily property with 50 parking spaces, that means you're in development, when your property goes live, 5 of your parking spaces have to be EV capable. Now, you don't have to install a single EV charging station in order to be in compliance with code right now. All you need to do is to have the infrastructure. What we're trying to do with the new construction rebate is nudge the developer, the decision makers, to go ahead and go above code and install the charging station. So how do we do that? We give, remember I mentioned, I think I put this in the chat, I said, the median price when we wrote the program for a level 2 charger was $2,900, right? So on top of all the retrofitting infrastructure work that we cover, we also send a rebate check of $1,450 per charging port. So you're getting all the infrastructure work plus a check to help offset the cost of the charging station. With new construction, in theory, SCE doesn't have to get involved at all, right? Because there's no retrofitting, no construction. You're not beholden to the throughput constraints that we have, right? And the way that we make it a better deal is we'll give $3,500 per port, right? So the logic is it covers not only the station, but any of the installation cost to get it installed and operational. So I can tell you, if you're in our territory and this is of interest to you, I'll post it again later. I'll also be in a breakout room. Scroll up and register, because, I think as all of us care about electrification and the sort of penetration of EV charging stations, we really want to capture folks at this time. We still have the options for retrofit, gets a lot of press, but really the new construction rebate is where we feel like we can make the most impact and be there along the way as you're sort of thinking through your electricity needs in development. So hopefully that answers that question.
I think that answers the question just excellently. All right. Next question. Given what we've heard from Philip at Peninsula Clean Energy, that L2 or low power, or L1 or low power L2 works fine, or at least for 94% of the drivers, would SCE consider splitting those full L2 EV capable into a much larger number of lower power chargers, or at least managed power? Tough question. I'll move on to Daniel and Sherry. What recommendations would you give to existing condo HOA and apartment managers, COSs, on EV charging?
You know, I can take this, the first part of that. I think the first thing is really taking a top-down approach with property management or with the S owner. That's where the decisions have to kind of flow through anyway. So getting a poll and understanding for how many residents would be interested in EV charging as an amenity or something that they would be contributing toward the installation for, say on the HOA resident side, would both be very beneficial in having a more streamlined approach versus a approach that is basically a ping pong ball going back and forth multiple times. So that would be my suggestion. And also looking for efficiency, not necessarily just where they want to pick and choose where the chargers go.
Yeah, I can follow up with the apartment manager point of view. And really drawing from what Daniel just said, oftentimes you get to the site and the apartment manager has a very specific idea of where they want chargers to be located, but oftentimes that's not the most economical location. So, first off is just getting your alignment on the most cost-effective location and getting buy-in on that, just like being flexible. If you don't want a huge cost share, this is what you're going to have to expect. We might have to have some flexibility in where we locate these chargers. And I would also say to any apartment managers who are like, well, I don't want to really install until I have a resident who has an electric vehicle. I would just try to encourage them to solve the chicken and the egg problem by anticipating that their residents will, and that they're going to lose residents as renters if they don't install now. So yeah, that's what I get the most is like, oh, well, we don't have anybody here that has an EV. Why would we do it? Like, why would we make the investment? The change is coming, and your renters would. They would consider it if they had a reliable place to charge.
Yeah, can I add to that? Definitely, right? What's my wife's Canadian, and I think there's a phrase like, something about, Wayne Gretzky said, go to where the puck is going or whatnot. So I think there's multiple ways to think about it, right? I'll give you an example. Let's say you're at a complex, Port Waname is an excellent. They only had 2 EVs, but they had an evangelist, that gentleman, the VP, who really pushed for it. It's the chicken and an egg, but it's a perfect example where they installed the stations and the number jumped up to 18, right? And they felt that, the occupancy rate benefited because of it. The other thing to think about is that in California, Q1 2022, this is from the California Department of Energy, 13% of all vehicles sold in Q1 of this year were all electric. You count hybrids and fuel cell, that's now 16%, right? So is it an apples and apples to say, if I have 100, parking spaces that, at least 15 of them are going to be by EVs, are going to be used by EV drivers? Not necessarily, but I think that, and thank you, Shashir, for clarifying the quote, but you got to think about future-proofing your property and making it competitive, right? So to say, well, I don't have any EV drivers right now, right? It would kind of be like, well, my roof is fine right now, so I'm just going to wait till it collapses before I do anything about it. So That isn't to say that it's always the best idea to install EV charging on your property, but what I would encourage any multifamily property owner is to at least do your due diligence. Especially in our territory, you can get a free EV readiness study, right? And I'll just share that with retrofit work, because of the demand we're seeing for charge ready, if you apply tomorrow, it'll take, best case scenario, if everything goes smoothly, 14 months, right? And it's what I referenced before, a throughput issue, and why we also try to get new development, because with new development, it's customer driven more than us, right? There's only so much bandwidth. I wish we could do it for every customer, as quickly as possible, but there is a throughput issue. So definitely encourage folks to do your due diligence right now. I think utilities across the country are offering options for you, and you should utilize them. Like I tell people, like, put us to work, put the EV charging station companies to work, make them crunch the numbers for you and figure out what makes sense for your property. Like, we're here to help get it to the finish line.
Circling back on the solar question, another piece of advice that I would give property managers and energy efficiency managers for apartment communities: when you're working on doing the solar installations, plan the demand with the EV charging. Like, make sure that you actually have an adequate panel for supporting EV chargers when you're already doing all these electrical infrastructure upgrades for your solar project. That's the time to make sure that you've got enough panel space, that you've got your solar system size to produce energy to support charging, so that you can offset your costs more. So yeah, there's certain things that you can do to plan ahead too, especially folks that are participating in the SOMA program or other solar incentive programs, to get the building ready for charging infrastructure, rather than having to do it all again in another retrofit.
Well, those are all incredibly important things that we've all discussed. So thank you all panelists for your time.